Good afternoon. Welcome to the April Living with Disability Research Centre seminar. If you're joining us for the first time, we will follow the usual format that we have two sets of presentations. The first hour, after the first hour, we'll have a break. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions through the Q&A. So if you've got a question, please put it in the Q&A box and the speakers will answer it when they've finished doing their presentations. So this afternoon, we're focusing on the experiences of LGBTQA plus people with a disability. And we've got two sets of presenters. And it's really fantastic to be able to introduce you to the first two speakers, which is Professor Adam Bourne and Dr. Natalie Amos from the Australian Research Centre for Sex, Health and Society, which is commonly known as ARCHES, which is here at La Trobe University. And they led a large study that was commissioned by the Royal Commission into violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation of LGBTQA plus people with a disability. And they're going to present some of the highlights from that study this afternoon. So Adam's going first. I'll hand over to you, Adam. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris. It's really nice to come along to this seminar and have the opportunity to present the findings from this work that we've been doing in collaboration, I must say right from the outset, with you and with your centre, which has been a huge privilege. So as Chris said, I'm Adam Bourne, I'm Professor of Public Health and I'm currently the Acting Director of the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society at La Trobe. And in my substantive role, I am the Deputy Director and lead the LGBTQ Health and Wellbeing Research Programme, which spans a whole range of topics and issues relating to LGBTQA plus people in Australia. I don't want to assume that everyone has the same level of familiarity or understanding in relation to gender identity, sexuality and sex characteristics. So I just want to take just a minute at the start to cover some basics in terms of the terminology that Nat and I are going to be utilising in today's presentation. So this is a kind of a very quick LGBTQ 101 in relation to some of this terminology. So there's a variety of ways in which we can think about ourselves, our identities and our bodies. If we start in the blue box on the left-hand side to begin with, sex refers to the kind of mechanics of our bodies. Our sex reflects our organs, our hormones and our chromosomal makeup as typically XX or XY, although there are a variety of variations in our chromosomes that come about. You can be XXY, you can be XYY. There's more than 50 or so variations in sex chromosomes that have been documented. And when someone isn't simply XX or XY, they possess a different chromosomal variation in their sex characteristics, then they can be referred to as intersex. And so that's the term, that's the I within the LGBTIQ that you will often see utilized. Our sexuality is the way that we think about our connection to other people and the physical or the emotional attraction that we might have towards other people. So the majority, the dominant attraction or sexuality that people hold is heterosexual. Everyone has sexuality, most people, it's heterosexual. But for a large minority of people, it could be other terms. It could be gay or lesbian, it could be bisexual, it could be pansexual. And so these are kind of commonly other utilized terms. Our gender identity is separate from our sex. Gender identity is a social construct. It's how you think about yourself and your gender, and a way in which you reflect your gender identity, you present your gender identity in the world. So someone might identify as a woman or a man, but they might also identify as neither. They identify as a non-binary person who doesn't occupy one of these binaries as being a man or a woman. Someone may have been assigned one gender at birth, but now identify and seek to affirm a different gender identity to that they were assigned at birth. And if that's the case, then they might refer to themselves or could be referred to as transgender or as trans or gender diverse. Someone who has the same identity as that they were assigned at birth. So for example, I was assigned male at birth. I still identify as male. So I can be described as cisgender, which just means that I still hold the same identity as I have done from birth. And that's kind of what we're referring to in those boxes underneath. Queer is a slightly more general term that can be an individual person's identity. Some individuals will think of their sexuality as being queer, or even their gender identity as being queer. And that is reflecting a kind of non-normative gender identity or sexuality. But queer can also be utilized as an umbrella term in reference to LGBTIQ people in general. So you'll sometimes hear people talking about the queer community. Now that's a terminology which is probably a bit more common among younger people than it is among adults. It was a term that was quite pejorative, was quite negative. It's been reclaimed by many younger people and used in kind of more celebratory and affirming ways of years have gone by. So that's the quick 101. What we're speaking to today is, as Chris said, is a major new report that we published towards the end of last year with support from the Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of People with Disability. And this was a project that was a partnership between our two research centres that ran through lots of last year. Now, the project involved a really diverse and wonderful group of people of queer people with disability, people who were trans and gender diverse, people who had a variety of sexualities and sexual orientations. And here on the screen here, you see Ivy McGowan, a fabulous trans femme person who was a wonderful and extremely highly valued member of our lived experience group for this project. And on the website for the project, which I'll show you a link to at the very end, you can find videos from each of the members of our lived experience advisory committee, where they talk about what the findings mean for them. A lot of these findings are quite confronting. They're statistical in nature, most of them, and they're quite harsh. And what we wanted was a way of reflecting what that really meant for an individual in the context of their everyday life. And so Ivy and Thomas and Margarita and some of the others give their perspectives about what these findings really mean and what it meant for them to be part of this project as a member of this lived experience group as well. So Nat will play one of these a bit later on in her presentation, and I'd encourage you to go and have a look at some of the other ones on our website. So what we were doing in this project is we were taking data pertaining to people with disability from two very large surveys that our centre conducted in 2019. On a regular or semi-regular basis, we conduct big surveys of the LGBTIQ adult population in Australia, a survey that's called Private Lives, and of LGBTQA plus young people, which is a study called Writing Themselves In. You'll see the phrase "this is me" there, which is just the name, it's the brand name that's given to the study when it's in the field. But the report that comes out at the end of it is titled Writing Themselves In, and it's been running since about 1998. These are really, really big surveys. They offer a kind of snapshot about the health and well-being of LGBTQA plus adults and young people at a point in time. They cover all manner of topics across mental health, suicidality, alcohol and drug use, experiences of coming out and the extent to which you're supported, experiences in school, in the workplace, LGBTIQ affirming experiences in healthcare contexts, intimate partner violence, experiences of stigma, discrimination and abuse, like a really, really, really wide range of topics. And I often think about it as a small amount of data spanning a very, very wide range of topics and issues. They were conducted in the latter half of 2019, so that's quite important to bear in mind because all of these data are pre-COVID. in nature. And in fact, as you'll see, the data are bad enough as they are, but but we actually have indications that in many of these experiences got worse in the context of COVID-19 as well. The surveys are largely recruited through social media, Instagram, Facebook, and the like, with a small amount that comes through some of our community partners in the LGBTQ sector and in the LGBTQ and in the youth specific sector as well, but most come through online and paid advertising. We were very fortunate that in both of these studies, quite a large number of people with disability participated. And in fact, over 2,500 LGBTQA plus people with disability were included across in Private Lives 3. And a big diversity in terms of those people with disability in relation to their gender, their sexual orientation, quite a large proportion from a multicultural background and living in a variety of inner suburban, outer suburban, regional and remote locations. Now, this is important because we've never really had the opportunity before, not only to look at the intersection of LGBTQ people with disability, but we can go a step further again, and we can look at intersections of people with queer people with disability from multicultural backgrounds or living in regional remote communities as well. And we can be quite granular, not assuming that all LGBTQ people are the same, but actually teasing out what those experiences can look like if you're a trans person with disability or a non-binary person with disability or a cis woman with disability. And so that was a really exciting, for us. I guess I'll just say in relation to writing themselves in, a very similar number of people with disability who participated, which was great to see. And again, a wide range, considerable diversity in terms of their characteristics, which allows for that kind of granular level analysis and disaggregation of data, which we've simply never been able to do before in Australia. In fact, there are a few studies globally that have allowed this kind of level of detailed analysis that we've been able to accomplish in these two studies. And so it was in acknowledgement of those very large data sets that the Royal Commission funded us to do a much more focused analysis, just looking at the sample of people with disability across these two surveys. In order to identify people with disability within the study, we took a slightly different approach within each survey. When we ran Private Lives 3, we did some consultation with a variety of different partners working in the disability sector, and we spoke to one of the Department of Health of Victoria's disability advisory groups. And the advice we received at that point in time, there was a strong steer towards using the the Australian Institute for Health and Welfare's standardized disability flag module, which I imagine some of you might be familiar with. It asks a series of questions about everyday experiences, on the back of which you're classified into having no disability, mild, moderate, or severe disability. Now, that prompted, although we did a fair amount of consultation in the run-up to this, I think what we became quickly aware of as it entered into the field is the nature of the discussion and debate, which has been ongoing for a little while, about the suitability of those questions and the kind of quite clinical framing of them. And we were encouraged to reflect upon how we could adopt slightly more social models of understanding and reflecting disability in the work that we were doing. And so we had the opportunity in Inviting Themselves In, which ran a few months later, for us to revise the way we were asking this. And instead, we asked questions of people to help understand the specific nature of their disability and the type of disability that they had, rather than this classification into mild, moderate or severe. So it slightly complicates the story of how we talk about the data, but we felt it was important to kind of, to listen to that feedback we were getting about the suitability of the disability flag, hence the revisions that we made and how we asked it in the youth survey Inviting Themselves In for. I really think it's important, before jumping in to talk about some of the findings of all of this, just to give a kind of forewarning about how challenging some of them are. I think content warnings are important, particularly when you're talking about matters relating to suicidality and intimate partner violence. These are very deeply concerning topics, and ones that many people can find quite personally affecting. And in relation to this population, I'm afraid the data are harrowing. I'm not someone who's prone to using hyperbolic language very often. In fact, I try quite hard not to further pathologize LGBTQ communities, because that's something we've had a habit of doing for a very long time. In this particular population and on these topics, I'm afraid you almost have no choice but to be slightly alarmist in the language, given how considerable some of these experiences and the extent of need is. So I just wanted to say that before reflecting what some of these look like. So we'll start with findings relating to harassment and abuse. I'm afraid to say that it was extremely widespread. We've taken just a smattering of findings from across the reports to flash up on the screen to you right now. The report is about 280 pages long. There's 200 or so different tables that break down different kinds of experiences, and I'm presenting to you in 10 minutes about 2% of what what's contained in that report. And there's a lot of questions we asked about experiences of physical, verbal, sexual harassment or abuse, and in a range of different kinds of contexts in which people were having that experience. These are just two that I wanted to pull out and to emphasize. I think the extent of sexual harassment was considerable, and it was much, much higher among adults with moderate disability, for example, compared to those without disability. So it was twice as likely among those with disability than those without disability in our LGBTQ adult survey in private lives. If you're looking at young people, 52% experienced verbal harassment, specifically in relation to their gender identity or sexuality in the last 12 months. And again, that's quite a lot higher for this group of people, young people with disability, than was the case for young people without disability. So it's high across the board, but it's higher still among those with disability is the story. In relation to mental health and suicidality, as I kind of alluded to, some of these statistics are particularly concerning. It's slightly terrifying, I think, that among adults with disability, 7% had attempted suicide at some point in the last 12 months. Now, if you put that in context, that compares to about 2.6% of LGBTIQ people without disability. Now that's already too high. And if you look at general population statistics, as best as we're able to determine, that is, we would expect to see this closer to about 0.5%. So general population, not LGBTIQ specific, not disabilities, but not person with disability specific, maybe we'd see 0.5% of the population having attempted suicide. We're seeing 7% of LGBTQA plus adults with a moderate disability having attempted suicide. That is considerably, an order of magnitude higher than we would expect to see. Among young people with disability, more than 90% were experiencing high or very high levels of psychological distress using a standardized instrument, which again is higher than those without disability, which again is higher, much, much higher than we would expect to see in the general population. I think about 4 times higher than what we would expect to see in the general population of young people in Australia. And a staggering 39.8%, so nearly 4 in every 10 people, young people aged 14 to 21, had attempted suicide at some point in their lives. Now, a particularly sobering statistic, I think, among a sample of people that was this young, that such a high proportion had attempted suicide at some point in their lives. And what's, I guess, similarly concerning is that even among those people who had attempted suicide or self-harm, quite a high proportion, nearly a third, had never accessed any kind of professional mental health support in relation to those experiences of those thoughts or experiences of trying to take, of attempting to take their own life. A kind of a smattering of other findings. If we looking at young people with disability, we asked quite a few questions around the extent to which they feel safe or included in educational contexts. And 56.7% said that they didn't, that they felt unsafe in their educational setting due to their sexuality or gender identity. 72%, nearly 73%, said that they felt the voices of LGBTIQ people are not heard or understood within their communities, which is kind of really alarming and concerning to see in an era where we've made so many other inroads in relation to LGBTIQ inclusion and social acceptance, but still people feeling like their voice isn't being heard. If we look at data in relation to family violence, of which we asked quite a few questions in the Private Lives Adult Survey, 67% of those with a mild disability, 69% of those with a moderate disability, and 73% of those with a severe disability reported experiencing violence from an intimate partner at some point in their lives, which again is higher in every instance compared to those without disability. I think I don't have a lifetime measure in my head in relation to the general population, but certainly within the last 3 years, data from the Victorian Population Health Survey would indicate that around 7% of people will have experienced intimate partner violence at some point in the previous 3 years among the general population. So what we're seeing here is an indication that this is much, 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 much higher than we would expect in other parts of our community. Similarly, we ask questions not just about intimate partners, but about family members, and by which we mean family of origin members, the people that the family members that people were raised with, that they grew up with, which can be separate for an LGBTIQ person from their family of choice and the people that they choose to describe as their family as adults. Often that comes about when there's experiences of rejection from families of origin. They create families of choice instead. But in this context, we're asking about families of origin. And again, very high proportions reporting having experienced violence from a family member, yet again, higher than what we observe among the sample of people without disability in our studies. And once again, really concerning to see that a very high proportion of those having such experiences not reaching out to professional services for support in relation to those kinds of experiences. In a moment, Nat's going to talk to you about some even more detailed analysis we've done, looking at the association between these kinds of experiences, particularly looking at the association between experiences of abuse and harassment, and how those are associated with experiences of mental ill health among LGBTQA plus people with disability. So this, what I'm presenting, is just a snapshot for the moment. We pulled out quite a few recommendations from this report to the Royal Commission, and they operate really at 3 levels. At the structural and policy level, I think we've written that down twice there. I think that should have been structural and policy level, service level, my apologies. And on the next slide, it's about community level interventions. So in terms of structure and policy level interventions, we're really trying to highlight the importance of, at a very most basic level, recognizing and including LGBTIQ people within key disability strategies and within disability planning frameworks and with state action plans, as an example. In too many cases, the needs of or the existence of LGBTIQ people as having disabilities, or people with disability having a gender identity or a sexuality, simply not reflected and simply not acknowledged in the way that it needs to be. And so at the most basic of levels, calling out the absolute centrality of that. The importance of disability sector capacity and capability building to ensure LGBTIQ inclusion. So helping people working in the disability sector to understand the needs, the experiences of LGBTQ people, understanding the terminology, the cultural and social circumstances, some of the drivers that might be unique around their mental ill health, for example, or the drivers of intimate partner violence that might be specific to being an LGBTQ person as distinct from a person with disability. Capturing data around gender identity and sexuality in routine data sources and surveillance for people living with disability. And this is a conversation we've been having with the NDIA and NDIS about trying to better reflect gender diversity and sexuality in some of their routine data systems. And then at a service level, which is what that second column should be described as, kind of more nuance in how we are suggesting services think about disability services think about LGBTQA+ people, and how LGBTQA+ specific services can be thinking about people with disability, and greater cross-sharing of knowledge and expertise between these two domains, where there's considerable areas of excellence and some really some brilliant skills and knowledge that exists, but not necessarily cross between these two sectors. And in terms of community level interventions, further thinking about the kinds of campaigns and programs that could be introduced to combat ableism that unfortunately exists within LGBTQ communities as much as it exists within heterosexual and cisgender communities, and recommendations around resourcing LGBTQ organizations so that they are better equipped and better empowered to work with people with disability whenever possible, and likewise community organizations for people with disability better able to deliver and to work towards meeting the needs of LGBTQA+ people. So it's not like these skills and expertise doesn't exist. It's not necessarily always in the right places, and the connections between these two communities and sectors is nowhere near as good as it could be. I'm just going to close my section by pointing you to the project webpage, and perhaps we can pop this in the chat, a link to this page afterwards. You'll see there's quite a large collection of resources that we developed. There's the main report. There's also an easy read version of the report. There's a video summary from me doing a 5-minute overview of some of the content, and then there's 4 lived experience videos, one of which Nat will show you in just a moment, from our advisory group that talk about, as I said, what these findings mean for them. And there's a series of social media tiles that if people are interested to promote this kind of work, to kind of facilitate a dialogue or discussion around LGBTQ people with disability within their services, then you're perfectly free to download these social media tiles and utilize them we suggested people utilizing them on days of visibility, the International Day for People with Disability, when there's days promoting awareness and inclusion of LGBTQA+ people. We try to make these kinds of resources available so that people would like to share them on those days. It saves you having to create resources from scratch. And those are all freely available to download on that website. Nat, at this point, I think I'm going to stop my share. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks, Chris, as well, for the introduction, for having us along to share this this work. I'll just find my PowerPoint to share. There we go. So Adam's done a really great overview of the report and a sort of an introduction and background to this other piece of work that we did for the Royal Commission, which was to draft up two papers for academic publication that did a sort of more in-depth look at the data. So we've done two papers, one looking at Private Lives 3, which is now published with the Disability and Health Journal, and one paper for writing themselves in 4, which is currently under peer review, but both of those will be made available through that website as well that Adam showed. Once they are published, they'll be up there. So I wanted to just provide now a kind of a brief overview of what these papers looked at and what they found. And I'll talk first about the analyses that were conducted with the adult data from Private Lives 3, which explored the factors that were associated with experiencing abuse among LGBTQ people with disability. So essentially looking at who was most vulnerable to or at risk of experiencing different forms of abuse. Go to my next slide. There we go. So this, I realize now, kind of repeats what Adam has already shown you about the data from kind of who was involved. So this paper looked at the 2,629 LGBTQA adults with disability from Private Lives 3. And this was determined, as Adam said, using the disability flag. The majority of these participants were between 18 to 34 years old. And then we had decent distributions of the sample across sexual orientation and genders as well. What we found in the data, again, was high rates of abuse within the sample, with 43% reporting verbal abuse, 17% of participants with LGBTQA participants with disability reporting sexual assault, and half of participants reporting that they'd been socially excluded based on their gender or sexual identity in the past 12 months. So these are all based on sexual identity and gender in the past 12 months. And again, these rates were much higher than those found among LGBTQ adults in PL3 without disability. So a range of demographic variables were examined as potential correlates of either verbal abuse, sexual assault, or social exclusion in order to better understand who among LGBTQ adults with disability were at a heightened risk of experiencing these forms of abuse. And we found that trans women and non-binary people were the most likely to report verbal abuse and social exclusion. These findings are really in line with broader contexts of stigma for trans and gender diverse populations who tend to report greater levels of stigma, discrimination, and non-acceptance compared to cisgender people. We also observed a higher likelihood of reporting verbal abuse and social exclusion among people with disability who identified as bisexual. And again, this reflects also broader context around biphobia, which can emerge as hostility specifically directed towards this group, as well as marginalization within both lesbian and gay communities, as well as mainstream communities. LGBTQ people with disability of an older age were less likely to report these experiences of abuse than younger people in the sample. It might be that this is due to this age cohort growing up in a time when stigma related to sexual or gender identity was even greater than it is today. And so it's possible that these experiences of abuse were normalized and therefore not as easily recognized or reported by this part of the sample, this age group. However, we don't know this for sure. We don't have, this is just sort of our best guess as to why this finding occurred. And we really need more research, particularly qualitative research with this population with LGBTQ people with disability across ages to really understand these experiences across ages. LGBTQ people with disability living in rural or remote areas were more likely to report sexual assault, and this points to potential sociocultural factors related to marginalization or vulnerability, again, that need to be further explored. And finally, those who were classified by the disability flag as having a more severe disability also tended to be more likely to have experienced verbal abuse and social exclusion. So we ran similar analyses with the data from young people in writing themselves in 4 with disability. And for these analyses, we explored sociodemographic factors associated with experiencing harassment or abuse, as well as associations with mental health outcomes, as Adam mentioned before. So again, we used the data from 2,500 LGBTQA youth with disability from writing themselves in 4, and again, with decent distributions across age and sexual orientation and gender. The measures of abuse used for these analyses from writing themselves in 4 differed slightly to those that we used for Private Lives 3, but we still observed similar patterns with high rates of abuse found among LGBTQ people with young people with disability. And so this included almost half reporting verbal abuse in the past 12 months based on their gender or sexual identity, 12% reporting physical abuse, and almost a third reporting sexual harassment. And again, these rates were substantially higher than those found among young LGBTQ people without disability. And I want to also reiterate here what Adam said as well, that still with the young people, the young LGBTQA people without disability, these rates of abuse are still outrageously high, just even higher for those with disability. So we also again found several sociodemographic factors to be associated with the experience of abuse. Verbal harassment was more likely to be reported by trans men, participants with an intellectual disability, and those who were out to most or all of their family. Being out in this situation is more, it sort of looks like an argument against being out, but really what this is just those that are more visible are more likely to experience abuse. So there are other mental health implications and other well-being implications of not being able to disclose your sexual orientation to family. Physical harassment was most likely to be experienced by young people with a physical or sensory disability, and sexual harassment was more likely to be experienced by trans women and those with a physical or sensory disability. And as I mentioned with the adult findings as well, it's often the case that trans people report higher frequencies of discrimination, harassment and abuse, which is likely to arise from higher levels of stigma and non-acceptance from others across a range of settings than what is experienced by cisgender people. For these analyses among young people, we also looked at associations between experiences of abuse and mental health outcomes. And among young LGBTQA people with disability who had experienced any abuse in the past 12 months, we found that they were more likely to report suicidal ideation in the past 12 months, more likely to have attempted suicide in the past 12 months, and also more likely to report high or very high levels of psychological distress. And these findings really further underscore the serious impacts of abuse. LGBTQA young people are known to have disproportionately high rates of mental health challenges already, and this is largely owing to the impact of stigma and discrimination. And these findings point to experiences of abuse as potentially major factors in mental health outcomes among those with disability. It also suggests a need for not only preventing and addressing such experiences, but also for providing significant mental health support where these experiences are known to have occurred. So just to sum up the results of these studies, they demonstrate high rates of experiences of abuse and harassment among LGBTQ adults and youth with disability. They also illustrate that these experiences are not felt equally across this population, with some intersections of LGBTQ people, such as those who are trans or gender diverse, at greater risk of experiencing abuse. In line with the recommendations made by the national report that Adam outlined just before, these findings also suggest a need to prevent and address experiences of abuse among LGBTQA people with disability. Policymakers and service providers are likely to have an important role to play in fostering safe and supportive environments for LGBTQ people with disability. It's especially important to ensure that LGBTQA people with disability can safely disclose their sexual or gender identities, have spaces in which to be themselves and feel socially included, respected, and valued. Ensuring that disability services provide a safe and respectful environment for those who identify as LGBTQA is also crucial. Also making programs available to organisations to ensure that they meet the standards of inclusivity and safety, including staff training, are especially beneficial. And governments and policymakers can also play a role here by ensuring standards are met across health and educational services, as well as devising initiatives or programs to raise awareness and prevent abuse toward LGBTQA people with disability. And as Adam mentioned, I wanted to show one of the videos that were recorded for this project as well. This is Thomas Banks, who is a queer man with cerebral palsy. And it's about a 5-minute video, which hopefully will work when I play it.
Hi everyone, my name is Thomas Banks. I have now cerebral palsy and I identify as gay. So I have done a lot in our community. What I do is to improve a life of people with disabilities or LGBTQ. For me, it means I am using my knowledge, my passion, and my abilities to make a world more safer for people with disabilities. For LGIA services, I would like to see more acknowledgement of people with disabilities, sexuality, because it never acknowledged as people might be from LGBTI community or people with disability access, because it is a taboo topic for a lot of service providers. I would like to see LGBTIQ panel services, people accepting of people with disabilities is more welcoming, because so much of the time we so ask, but we just feel like very welcome. Because I feel like people judge my disability more and not me as a person. Like whenever I'm asked about, men acknowledge me, but it really difficult for me to have some forgotten with people. So last night I was in a sauna. I wanted to talk to someone, but I realized as my disability might get in a way of it, because of how I communicate with our community to do better is if I say as a venue come and talk to us, because it has a lot of effort for people with disabilities to come out. And many people with disabilities are a little bit nervous about coming out to venues because of what it is. For me, bodily, I want to live my life in my people happy. Want me to try it one more time?
Yeah.
I love that video with Thomas Banks, and I think he really covers a couple of important points of that intersection of being LGBTQ and having a disability, of that the sort of disability services and supports needing to be more inclusive of LGBTQA identities and affirming and understanding of those needs, while LGBTQ spaces also need to be more inclusive and accommodating of the needs of people with disability as well. So I want to finally, if I can get to the next slide, finally just acknowledge those that made this project possible. So those that made Private Lives 3 and Writing Themselves In possible, but also a special acknowledgement of the Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of People with Disability for funding this project, and the incredible expert advisory group who guided this project. And again, if you would like to access any of the resources from the project, they're available on the website through La Trobe and Arches. There is a dedicated page to this project, which, as Adam said, lists all the reports and any outputs, as well as the papers as they're published, will be available through that site as well. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Thank you very much, Natalie and Adam. That was some great presentations that, you know, you've explained the context, I think, really, really well, and some pretty worrying statistics there. Right, we might make a start again with our second presentation for today, and I'm going to introduce Kathryn Bartlett, who is a co-researcher working here at the Living with Disability Research Centre, and is also a self-advocate and a member of New Wave self-advocacy group in Gippsland, and Tessa May-Zirnsak, who is a PhD candidate at La Trobe in Humanities and Social Sciences, and does all sorts of work with various groups at La Trobe. And they're reporting on a study that's been going for some time, that was sponsored by LIDS and that was initially led by Lizzie Smith, who has since departed and gone off to join the NDIS and is doing really good work there. So I'm going to hand over to you, Tessa and Kathryn, to talk about Because It's Who I Am. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. So yeah, as Chris said, we're talking about self-determination and belonging for LGBTQ adults with intellectual disability. Kathryn, would you like to start by telling people what you think the most important thing that we're going to share today is?
The research of what we found in the project and what we find, and we're going to share it with you.
Yeah, great. So we're going to start with, oh, sorry, Kathryn, we're about to say something.
We're going to share a video from a self-advocacy group from Rainbow White.
I'm sexy
and I'm proud. Me and my partner turn up way up loud. He doesn't care how I look or that I'm a man. I'm sexy and he gets me the way I am. This is me for all the world to see. The way I am is who I'm meant to be. I got the right to love anybody. Living is wild and free. Living is wild and free. I'm proud of the body I was born in. It's taken me years, but lots of love left in it. And I'm free to choose the way I play. This is me for all the world to see. The way I am is who I'm meant to be. I got the right to love anybody. Living is wild and free. Living is wild and free. I don't feel equal yet when you only see a disability. When I got a way to go till I celebrate my sexuality. This is me for all the world to see. The way I am is who I'm meant to be. I got the right to love anybody. Living is wild and free. Living is wild and free. With my family standing here with me, I can be anything I really want to be. Never see the light. I got my rainbow whites. We stand united. We are decided. This is me for all the world to see. The way I am is who I'm meant to be. I got the right to love anybody. Living is wild and free. Living is wild and free. This is me for all the world to see. The way I am is who I'm meant to be. I got the right to love anybody. Living is wild and free. 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 Living is wild and free.
So as Kathryn was saying, that's from Rainbow Rights, which is a LGBT advocacy group based in Melbourne, and we shared it with their permission. I think we wanted to start with this because we know that people with intellectual disability do identify as having diverse sexualities, and we know that often that can be pathologized or treated as a problem. But for the members of Rainbow Rights, that's not their experience. Kathryn, do you want to add anything to that?
No.
Great. Cool. So we know that LGBT people with intellectual disability have the same rights as anyone else. However, we also know that there are significant barriers to sexual equality, especially for people with LGBTQ identity, as opposed to heterosexual people with intellectual disability. But as Chris was saying and the previous presenters said, there also are barriers to expressing heterosexual identity, but we're not going to talk so much about that today. That's just kind of a bit of the background from which the people in our study came from when we came to talk to them. So in our study, and the existing literature kind of indicates that LGBT individuals with intellectual disability may encounter barriers to self-identification. So that's knowing themselves that they are LGBTQ before they can even come to tell someone else, coming out themselves to peers or staff, and then feeling as though they belong in their communities. Kathryn, did you want to add anything?
What do we know about the LGBTIQ plus people with the intellectual disability. No one is talking us seriously, brushing us off, saying that you are not LGBTQ plus. We know what we are and what to let people know. Openly, like the rest of the community.
Yeah. Cool. So for this little project, we spoke to LGBTQ people with intellectual disability, and we spoke to key informants. Now, Kathryn's going to tell us about the LGBT people with intellectual disability because Kathryn was involved in running the interview. So off you go, Kathryn.
We firstly talk to people via the before COVID in person. Then when COVID hit, it come online, and it then it
Yeah, so we spoke to 8 people with a range of genders and sexualities. As this was a qualitative research project, we didn't aim to have a representative sample because that's just not going to be possible with a small sample size. However, men probably were overrepresented in our study. And we used a vignette methodology, which involved showing pictures and then asking questions about the pictures. And some of those pictures are integrated into today's slides, and we'll go through them in a bit more detail. We also spoke to key informants, which they were recruited via snowball sampling and referral. And they were generally people who were working as professionals, so not necessarily people with disability or who identified as LGBTQ, but some people, did identify those ways, and that was fantastic to have them on board. But those interviews were more about policy and how organizations work, whereas the questions aimed at people with intellectual disability were more about their experiences and their thoughts and feelings. Cool. All right, so the vignette methodology involved, showing people images as a jumping off point. Kathryn, do you want to talk a little bit about the questions we asked?
Or letting people know it's not a choice, belonging, feel or belong in the group. Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
I have to start again. How people feel about it. Some people felt it easy. Some hard. Some just what?
Yeah.
depend on the disability.
Yeah. So we showed them images like the one that you're seeing now, and we'd ask questions, which is of, you know, two people kind of having a bit of a laugh together, and we'd ask them questions like, you know, someone, a person with disability in this photo identifies as LGBT. Should they tell their supporter? And so that way we could kind of elicit people's perspectives in a sort of practical way without asking them kind of directly what their experiences have been. And so they could just volunteer. If they wanted to share their experience, they could just volunteer that, or they could just talk to us abstractly about the two women. And that was, you know, that was sufficient. Yeah, great. So our key findings are related to two broad areas. So what people told us was important and the implications for practice. Kathryn, sorry, did you have something to say for this slide?
Come out, let people know it's not a choice. Belong, feel like belong in their group, like own little community. We think people generally did have a sense of belonging in our study. LGBTQ digital have to explain.
Yeah. So we've also found some implications for practice from the interviews that we did, both with people with intellectual disability and with the key stakeholders. So people with intellectual disability in our study responded really positively to the idea, and some volunteered this without necessarily being asked, of having visual cues that indicate that they specifically as LGBT people were welcome. So that's one thing that we'll talk about further in the slide. And the other was that LGBTQ people with intellectual disability would benefit from having their sexuality considered when engaging in planning. So yeah, so those were kind of the four major findings, and we'll talk about those in turn next. So Kathryn, do you want to go first for this one?
Can be a challenge for some people. Coming out can be a challenge for some people. Some people might not listen, might say, well done. Coming out takes a load off their shoulders, taking that burden away.
Yeah. Yeah. And we also found that one of the enablers for coming out was that people would sometimes experience access to supports or community groups related to their sexuality. But conversely, that was also another barrier, is that people felt that they might not be accepted, and that would be hard for them because of their dependence or use of services that might not affirm them. So, you know, as Kathryn was saying earlier, some people do feel quite concerned about a risk that people will tell them that they can't have a sexuality or they can't be LGBTQ. And you know, that can be even harder if you're dependent on a service who are telling you, you know, engage with people who are telling you that you can't have that. Cool. So this was another another image that we used in our study. So this is, people might know Hannah Gadsby. So for this one, we asked participants about clothing and about appearing as, you know, wearing kind of clothing that suits that affirms your gender and sexuality. So I'm going to read the quote now that one participant said when we asked them about this person. People probably giving her a hard time, but then if she's nice, strong lady, she should be able to ignore all those people and be able to wear what she wants to wear. But yeah, people just giving her a hard time about wearing a suit. But if they care about people's feelings, they shouldn't be saying anything at all. Kathryn, did you want to share any thoughts about that quote?
It's up to the individual person about what they feel comfortable wearing.
Yeah. And I think as well, with this one, what the person's highlighting is that it's the responsibility of the person to ignore people who might be harassing them or might be judging them for how they're choosing to present. And so that's kind of, you know, I think that's kind of speaking to internal resilience. But then I think also that the person does go on to reflect that, you know, that they shouldn't be saying nasty things at all. So I thought that was a really interesting way that people conceptualized you know, moving through the world as an LGBTQ person. Another participant said, and I'll read this quote aloud, "I get people who say, oh yeah, being gay is okay. But if I go into it anymore, or if I explain my gender, that's a bit too much for people." So for this one, I think this is highlighting that that this person experienced limits to what people were willing to tolerate in terms of their gender and sexuality. Kathryn, did you have thoughts for this one?
No.
Great. Okay, so we're going to talk about belonging now, which was the other kind of significant theme that we identified in the research. Kathryn, I think you had some notes for this slide.
I only got same quote.
Oh, okay. Well, did you have any thoughts you wanted to share anyway?
No.
Cool. All right. So people felt that they belonged when they experienced positive responses to coming out, like how Kathryn mentioned earlier about, you know, having someone say well done or kind of verbally expressing that the person, you know, belongs in terms of their sexuality and gender. Another enabler was that they had space to make choices and explore gender and sexuality and didn't have to fight for that space. So it was kind of offered freely as something that they could choose to do, not necessarily explicitly, but sorry, my cat's my cat's feeding time is 5, so she's getting excited. Yeah, so, you know, having not necessarily explicitly saying, okay, do you want to explore your sexuality and gender now, but knowing that having a sense that they could do that without it necessarily having repercussions. And another enabler was being aware that there was a broader movement around LGBTQ identity and that movement is a pride movement. So like what we saw in the video from Rainbow Rights, they experienced their sexuality as a positive thing through their engagement with others and through being able to, I don't want to speak for them, but, you know, through that kind of, that kind of community. So those are some of the key enablers. Some of the challenges were really around lack of support. So some people in our study expressed that they couldn't attend LGBTQ events because they had registration processes that they weren't able to be supported to work through. Some also felt that they couldn't engage in LGBTQ spaces because they didn't know anyone else who would be there. And often these issues were compounded by organisations and staff who viewed sexuality support as outside of their responsibility. So, you know, organisations that wouldn't support people to engage with LGBTQ spaces because you know, because they didn't see it as their job, basically. And of course, this had a big impact on people's sense of belonging and sense of feeling a part of a broader pride movement. So I have another quote from a participant that I'm going to read aloud. No, I have not attended Pride events because I don't know anyone who goes to it, and I also have not come out much other than a few people that are not family, and worry about judgment if I do come out. And this quote, this person offered this information when we showed them the image on the slide of this was Midsummer. So we showed them this image and we asked them if they'd ever been to an event like that. And this is what this participant said. Kathryn, did you have anything to share for this slide?
The person is scared of coming out to their family, might need some support about knowing where to go to find out to go to Pride events.
Yeah. And I think for this person, their barriers in their immediate community, so, you know, in this case, they've mentioned their family, prevent them from being engaged in a public or a broader pride movement. Great. All right. And I'm going to read, this is another one from a key informant. So this person came from an organisation as a staff member. If you ask any major disability support organisation, where are our gay clients? Where are our lesbian clients? They'll say, there's one or two. You know, I mean, that tells you everything you need to know. The general population is not represented in the disability support sector. It's just not. It's not anywhere close. And so the question is, what is it about those services, those places, those spaces that mean that people don't feel they're able to come out? Kathryn, did you want to add anything?
The worker probably doesn't understand about disability. With some workers, I don't want to say much because they are older and they might judge me.
Yep. Great. Cool. All right, so now we're going to talk about some of the practice-related findings that we had. So on the left we've got the pride flag. Now, this is the old one. This study was, I think we did it in 2018. So we picked the one that kind of we thought that most of our participants would kind of identify with. So anyway, so this is the image that we use, and we showed people, we asked them what it means to them. So Kathryn, did you want to start us off with any of your thoughts?
When I see it, I know where I belong. I like to see it when I go into places.
Yeah. And I think, and Kathryn, I'm not sure if you agree, that when we got to this part of the interview, so this kind of came in at about 3/4 of the way through the interview, there was a bit of a change in people. They seemed kind of quite happy to kind of see this image. And one participant said to us, I've got 3 of them in my bedroom. It means accepting. It means that you are part of the LGBTQ community. Yeah, and so people really felt that this expression of sexuality really aided in their belonging. And so, you know, we think that this is something that really mattered to people in a way that I know that I wasn't expecting when I started working on the study. Cool. So in terms of LGBT identity and person-centered planning, so when we so when we kind of spoke to people, we were kind of like, oh, you know, what could we kind of bring back to the service landscape? And what we found is that not everybody that we spoke to wanted necessarily the same things, and people will be at different places on their journey. So in our study, a lot of the people with intellectual disabilities that we spoke to were were quite settled in their identity, and that's probably why we were able to recruit them. I think that we probably underrepresented people who, you know, didn't feel that they could talk about their sexuality. So that's a part that we didn't really we weren't really able to address through the research. And so, you know, our findings likely overrepresent the needs of people who are kind of quite staunch and quite active in the Pride movement and in affirming their identity and wanting to see change in their places and spaces. But what people did say was that they wanted to work with staff who would understand their needs. So for services, that might be an opportunity to match staff based on the person's needs and in consultation with them as well. And also, it's an opportunity for organisations to look at, you know, if their staff need training in how to respond to, you know, to a disclosure of kind of any sexual identity, but particularly LGBTQ identity, because, you know, there is some literature to suggest that, you know, that it's a pretty fraught space no matter your sexuality. And having those supports in place, or having those kinds of, you know, like people around them who understand, and, you know, having their wishes considered by their supporters may improve people's sense of belonging and identity. Another thing that services can do is foster opportunities for the person to engage with the communities of their choosing. So that would be things like going to Pride or Midsummer, but also things like going to Rainbow Rights, or even just, you know, but like bars that, like gay bars and other scenes where, you know, there are events happening all the time in Melbourne, and the people we spoke to wanted to be more engaged with those and wanted support to engage with those. Did you want to add anything, Kathryn?
No.
Great. Okay, so we're just going to finish up with the key messages that we have from this from our research. So we know that LGBTQ people with intellectual disabilities have the same rights to express sexuality as everyone else, but that these rights are not actualized, and that's something that we have to do better. Services should engage with people with disability to support them to do activities of their choosing, and this is across the board, but people with LGBTQ identity that we spoke to found this to be a specific issue related to how they wanted to live their lives. Sorry. And, you know, LGBTQ people want to feel that they're accepted and valued, and that by kind of meaningful engagement and reflection in how we can engage LGBT communities and disability communities, you know, how we can kind of bring those two together is a way to kind of build that acceptance and show that this community is valued. Kathryn, did you want to add anything?
They know what they want and what they want in life.
Yeah. And then we just had 2 references at the start if you wanted to follow those up. But, you know, that's us. We've allowed, you know, some time for questions. And, you know, thank you so much for listening. And I hope that you've, you know, learned something. Kathryn, did you want to say anything to finish up?
No.
Great. Thank you.